Fresh Arts International presents Fresh Talk, conversations about creativity in the 21st century. I'm Cathy Byrd, and I'm the director-producer of Fresh Talk. Tonight, I'm speaking by Skype with Helena Reckitt. Helena is a curator and critic based in London and is a senior lecturer in curating at Goldsmiths, University of London. From 2006 to 2010, she was senior curator of programs at Toronto's The Power Plant, and other positions that she's held include senior director of exhibitions and education at the Atlanta Contemporary Arts Center in Georgia, head of talks at the Institute of Contemporary Arts, London, and associate commissioning editor for film and performance studies at Routledge, London. In 2011, she was the Clark Curatorial Fellow at Victoria University, Wellington, New Zealand. Tonight, we're talking specifically about her curatorial project for Nuit Blanche in Toronto. Nuit Blanche, if you don't know about it, is an all-night art event that animates the cities in which it's held from dusk to dawn. It originated in 2002 in Paris, and it's traveled to many cities since then. Helena is curator of Zone C at Nuit Blanche on Saturday, September 29th this year. Her project is titled Once More with Feeling. She's working with a number of artists that she believes embody, or their works embody, this concept, and we're going to talk more about that now. Helena, you've stated that for you the project explores the desire to repeat and remake, evoking circuits of renewal as well as movements of revolt. And I'm wondering, why do you think this theme is one that's important to explore?
Part of the idea behind the theme, Once More with Feeling, is because I have seen quite a few Nuit Blanches in Toronto. It's been going since 2006, and it started off as a real experiment, and nobody knew whether it was going to work. And it took off extraordinarily, as you will remember when you were there a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago. It has really taken the city by storm. About 1 million people come out to Nuit Blanche, which is about 1 in 4 people who live in Toronto, which is sort of crazy. But there's also a sense that the event's reaching perhaps a point of a certain, repetitiveness, and perhaps a certain ennui has entered in. So when I was asked to put together one of the zones, that was, I think, part of my interest. Well, how do we do this? But how do we do it again with feeling? How do we kind of put the sentiment back into it, put the emotion back into it, and really sort of, I suppose I was just really fascinated by what a communal event of this nature, what does it open up? What does it mean to go to an event like this, a big art event, where you're seeing art with hundreds and hundreds of other people? And how does that make you feel? Both part of a group and perhaps also very alienated and maybe not part of the group at all. And because it's a 12-hour event, it begins at 6:59 in the evening and it ends at 6:59 in the morning. There's a sense of, the minutes passing, the hours passing, the night passing, and the cycles of a night, and how an art project can feel so different at 7 p.m. where mums and dads are taking their kids around, or 5 a.m. where people are exhausted, stoned, drunk, cold. So I was thinking that idea of the sort of looping, repetitive nature of the event is quite compelling to me.
And which of the projects that you are presenting literally revolve, repeat, or feedback?
Or in some ways, almost all of them. And I chose the theme also because I thought it was an open enough brief that it didn't, I didn't want to sort of start scrambling around looking for art that illustrated a theme. But because I was attracted to, my initial idea was to work with, all the pieces were going to be around sound. So, of course, the repetitive nature of music, the refrain, that made this idea of repetition very, very easy. At a certain point, I decided that making it all around sound was a bit limiting in terms of forcing me to just work with certain artists, but also maybe a bit tricky, because I started to think about the logistics of an event with almost 1 million people, and I thought, oh, my subtle sound works might get a bit lost. So I dropped that as a sort of insistence, but this idea of yes, the refrain and the loop was the sort of, when I was looking at works, I would keep coming back and say, well, does it in some way have a looping structure? I mean, it's going to be repeated for 12 hours. My biggest project is by the Trisha Brown Dance Company, and it's a kind of, fabulous iconoclastic, choreographer who came up in the mid-60s, and this is a work from 1968, which hasn't been shown very often. And I was attracted to it partly because it is a very spectacular work. The facade of a building is covered with dancers who make their way across the sheer face of a building. It's spectacular, but it's also unspectacular because their movements are quite everyday. So it's not sort of Cirque du Soleil, it's a sort of anti-Cirque du Soleil. It's, very, in a way, understated. So that will be repeated by successive waves of dancers throughout the night. And then there are some works that revolve in a much more sort of literal way. So an artist that you'll remember from Atlanta, Dan Walsh.
Mm-hmm. I saw his name.
Yeah, who goes by the artist name of J.D. Walsh. He's animating an underpass with these video projections, which turn everyday architectural motifs into a record player, a cymbal, a trumpet. So it becomes a sort of visual as well as audio orchestra. So yeah, but a lot of the works have this sense of kind of haunting, things that come back to us. So one of the pieces, which is a few years old now, but I just couldn't resist putting it in, is a piece by the Scottish artist Katie Patterson. It's called Earth, Moon, Earth, Moonlight Sonata Reflected from the Surface of the Moon. And when you go, and I've got it installed in this stunning 19th century theatre space, but very elegant, the Elgin Theatre. When you go in, you will see play a piano just playing itself. And what you think you're hearing is Moonlight Sonata, but something's a little bit off. And what you realize is, there'll be a text to explain that what Katie has done is worked with amateur radio enthusiasts to bounce a recording of Moonlight Sonata off the moon, translate it into Morse code, and then record what's bounced back. And then transcribe that back into a score, which is played by this automatic piano. So it's sort of Moonlight Sonata, but not, because it's missing certain notes. Because, as she puts it, certain notes have been trapped on the surface of the moon or lost on their way back to Earth. So there's this, I think, very evocative idea that sounds never die, but they just reverberate around the universe, which is a concept that Marconi, the radio innovator, put forward.
Which of the artists that you selected engage specifically with sound that has what you would call a haunting or hallucinatory effect?
Probably the most clear example of that is a piece by a couple of artists who live in Berlin. They're from Vancouver. They work together and they call themselves Hadley and Maxwell. They have a piece which is about the sort of cultural haunting of Kurt Cobain. Their piece is called Smells Like Spirit. And it's actually installed in the loading dock of the same theatre that I just mentioned that Katie Patterson has her piece in. And as you approach the loading dock, there are roadies hanging around, there's a trailer, there's obviously some kind of concert either being loaded in or loaded out. And from inside the theatre, you can hear a band rehearsing, and it's the sound of one of Kurt Cobain's last concerts. But they've also done a much more complicated soundtrack to go with that, where you hear Cobain, but you also hear the crowd. And it's really thinking about the role of the crowd in both obviously the propelling of Nirvana and Cobain to superstardom, but also ultimately in his opting out and just not being able to cope with that degree of adulation and that degree of pressure. It's about how his voice, his image, him as a sort of romantic, classic romantic male artist haunts us, and the haunting idea that we might have contributed, to his self-annihilation.
Well, in that vein also, I'm wondering, are there works that have a positive take in terms of the body's memory with music that would make you want to dance or make you feel good?
Absolutely. I was very keen that there was this sort of exhilarating element to my zone, because I do think Nuit Blanche is about this sort of communal experience and catharsis through communal experience. So one of the very fun pieces is called Body Xerox, and it's by a couple of artists who live in Berlin, called Ingvar Hollen and Simon Benny. And Body Xerox is a disco. They don't even call it an art club, actually. They just call it a party. And it's a disco, and there'll be DJs, and it's in a tent, and you go in, and there's dry ice, and loud music, and people having a sort of ecstatic time of it. But instead of disco lights, we have Xerox machines. So people obviously are creating their own light show through the Xerox machine. They're photographing, they're photocopying themselves, they're photocopying bits of their bodies, paper is piling up, chaos is ensuing. And I like that idea. I mean, Nuit Blanche always teeters on chaos, and I partly wanted to court some chaos and revel in it.
That is going to be wild.
It is. We have technicians on hand.
Oh, good.
There's a lovely piece, actually. One of the things that's quite challenging as a curator of Nuit Blanche is that you also, in addition to the pieces you choose or commission, you're also asked to select from open call, which, as you know, it's always a bit random. But one of the open call pieces that was submitted was so perfect for my zone. It's called Young Prayer, and it's by a young artist out in Nova Scotia called William Robinson. And it's an electric guitar installed in a church, which constantly is lowered and then smashes to the ground, and it makes these, crazy sounds, and it taps you into, Jimi Hendrix, the origins of rock and roll and sort of ecstatic religious experience kind of stuff that Dan Graham wrote about, when he wrote about Patti Smith and Altered State. So yes, that's a piece I was really thrilled to come across through the open calls. So we've got a lovely church for that. Very few works you just stand and look at in my zone. Most of them you connect to on a very sensory level, because that to me is what Nuit Blanche is about. So one of the pieces that's also involving music, and really think is beautiful for this project, is by a sound artist called Susan Stenger, who is from Buffalo and has worked with John Cage, and her work is very sort of Cagean, and it's called Full Circle. Yes, Full Circle, and we're installing it in a bandstand, and surrounding the visitor, the viewer, will be a series of speakers, and you're sort of enveloped in these waves of sound, which are based on various musical and temporal systems at play. And there are these sort of swelling and receding sounds. And you experience it on a very bodily level. And although I didn't commission the piece, it was in a festival in Newcastle. It's a 12-hour cycles, and it takes you through 12 hours with their very different quality. So to me, that was just a no-brainer. I was so thrilled to be able to include that.
So this is a project that actually marks the time that's passing.
Exactly.
And I do remember I did attend that Nuit Blanche in Toronto a few years back, and I appreciated the arc of energy in that 12 hours and seeking out energy at the wee hours in the morning and not necessarily finding it. It was definitely a struggle against time, I think, that Nuit Blanche sets for itself.
That's been I'm not really a big night owl, so for me, going to Nuit Blanche I'd be absolutely honest with you, going to Nuit Blanche for me has always been a very frustrating experience, because I know there's really good work out there, but there's so much work, because there's the curated stuff, but there's the open calls, and then there are independent projects, and then everyone and their mother decides to put something on in their front yard, which is my little contribution to Nuit Blanche. So you have this sense of the overwhelming. I think something like 3,000 artists are involved this year. That's about 2,800 too many, in my opinion. And so you can't deny the sort of exhaustion of Nuit Blanche and the sort of struggle of Nuit Blanche. So some of the works do, they sort of riff on that. So again, actually, through Open Call, I found a really fun piece by a couple of Toronto-based artists, Julian Hingaray-Nunez and Adam Svek. And it's called Nuit Blanche Survey and Critical Race, and the two artists have a race with each other to go and see all the pieces, to tweet about them and do podcasts about them, and their comments will be broadcast in a central location, and who can make it back to the finish line having crossed off all the projects is the sort of fun aim of their piece.
We'll have to add that website or that URL to our podcast so people can look it up. That sounds totally insane.
Doesn't it sound crazy?
Yes, it does.
I know.
It does not sound like anything I would choose to do.
No.
But I appreciate that they're going to do it for us.
And another artist is making a piece all around the idea of queuing. Because as you may recall, queuing is probably an inevitable part of Nuit Blanche, and that was again something as I was thinking about my pieces, I was like, I don't want anything that's going to involve somebody standing for an hour in a queue to then go into a gallery or a church or an office and see something for 5 minutes, because to me, that's really unfair on the viewer, but it's also unfair on the artist.
Right, because they're exhausted by the time they get in.
Yeah. So one of my artists has made a piece called Moth Maze, and it's a piece about a sort of queue system. It's a film, very, very lovely poetic film filmed in this lamp factory, but it takes you through a labyrinth. And that labyrinth queue structure is repeated in the sort of sculptural device that he has set up for where you actually see the film. So you can only see the film by queuing. So we're sort of making a positive out of the negative with this work.
Which of the projects creates what you call a sense of time outside time?
I would say the piece I mentioned earlier, Full Circle, Susan Stenger, it creates a sense of time inside your body, where you feel connected to something bigger than yourself and bigger than the place you're in. These sorts of swellings and sense of the force of sound, and then sound withdrawn. There's also another piece actually from the Open Call by a group called the Kirtan Collective, and essentially it's a sort of a group improvisation, music and dance sort of communal piece, where there's drumming, there's dancing, there's clapping, and they're making video projections from the ambient heat that comes from the crowd. So their sense of sort of being lost in a group.
And that sounds like one of like an exhilarating experience too, to be
Yes,
involved in. Very
exactly.
physical and light and sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I guess in the media saturation that is contemporary art in general, the world in general, the most surprising media that these artists work with might be the Xerox machine.
Maybe. Yeah, there is the Xerox machine is sort of anachronistic, isn't it? Now that we all have scanners and phones that we can do Instagram with, who needs a Xerox machine? Yeah, I would also say that perhaps slightly anachronistically as well, two of the pieces involve pianos,
Oh, yes, that's right.
playing of pianos. So there's the piece Katie Patterson's Earth, Moon, Earth, but there's also a work with two artists, Ruth Ewan and Maeve Brennan. And Maeve is a very, very skilled pianist, but with terrible stage fright to the point that generally she can't perform in public. The piece involves her going and trying to play a piece of music which she may actually fail to do. And that's a piece about the sort of pressure on the performer and the pressure on the artist, the pressure of a 12-hour sort of durational event like Nuit Blanche. And maybe, one option is for the performer to say, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to play the game. Sort of perhaps loops back into the Kurt Cobain idea of his sort of opting out. The audience will be seated. They will wait for her
I see.
to play or
It's
not.
a staged
And
event of sorts.
it's
Okay.
a staged event, and it could be a staged event of playing, it could be marvelous playing, it could be faulty playing, or there could be no playing.
And that's the risk we take going into that one.
Exactly.
What's the name of that piece?
It's called Tremolo.
Oh,
Which I
that's
think is a
beautiful.
musical term, isn't
It's
it?
beautiful.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, this is the piece that the Nuit Blanche people are most worried about.
I'm sure.
Because it's not, the whole idea is to produce a spectacle, something for people to and ah over, and part of me wanted to sort of challenge that a bit.
And I see that's why you wrote that you chose to embrace the potential of mistakes.
Exactly. I was just covering my ass with that.
I like that. I like that. And tell me now about the relationship of your idea to the Mayan End of Days that's prophesied for December 21st. How does this come into play?
I think it's again to do with the idea of repetition, because of course the end of days have been prophesied ever since there have been days. Frank Kermode wrote about the sense of an ending, and every era sees itself as an era in crisis, and there's always somebody who says, the apocalypse is nigh. To be honest, when I set up this zone, I wasn't really thinking about the Mayan End of Days, but there are a few pieces that where the artists are really interested in that. So Dave Diamond, an artist from Toronto, is making a piece called The Day After, Tomorrow, and he's sampling end of the world footage from 200 disaster movies, which play on this massive bank of monitors.
That's a cheerful piece.
It will be fun.
Actually, I bet it will be fun. There's probably some vintage film, right?
He has sampled almost. I mean, he has identified every disaster film, and I've got a little note from him here. Oh, here we go. He says he's representing pretty much every land-based disaster film ever made. I don't want viruses as they are non-visual. So he's created these sort of arbitrary criteria, and I think the fun will be, going, oh God, I know that movie, or there'll be, very iconic movies, and then they'll be completely forgotten, like rubbish B movies that probably should have been forgotten,
And so, what do you hope everyone remembers about Zone C?
I don't actually think that the viewers really give a damn which zone they're in. That's one thing.
Heck.
It's sort of curatorial kind of fantasy that people are, so attuned to your vision. I hope that they I hope that they kind of get lost in the zone. What I don't want is people zipping around and crossing off. Oh, seen that, seen that. I hope that there's something about the experience of being out in the middle of the night, with a load of other people, many of whom probably wouldn't be looking at contemporary art normally, in the middle of the city, and that it's, something happens to them that wouldn't happen to them in their everyday. And yeah, what more could you ask for as a curator? That's a very exciting prospect.
You've been listening to Fresh Talk with Helena Reckitt. Read more about Helena and hear other podcasts in this series on freshartinternational.com.